My grandfather was originally from a small rural town in Venezuela, a place surrounded by wide plots of land, irrigation canals, and endless crops stretching to the horizon. To outsiders, it looked like a quiet and peaceful town, but those who worked the land knew otherwise. They all shared the same uneasy belief, something they spoke about openly. Since I was a child, I had heard uncles and neighbors whisper that La Llorona appeared in those fields. I never believed them until the day my grandfather finally told me what he had experienced. He spoke with a seriousness I had never seen before, as if the memory still carried fear with it. My grandfather worked on a large plot of land on the outskirts of town. He planted, watered, harvested, nothing out of the ordinary. That afternoon, he had argued with my grandmother over a misunderstanding fueled by jealousy. Angry and restless, he decided not to return home early and stayed behind to work instead. It was around 11 at night when he was still planting rows he wanted to finish before dawn. A kerosene lamp rested on the ground beside him, barely illuminating a small circle while everything else remained swallowed by darkness. The moon was bright and the air was calm. He focused on his work until, suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped sharply. Without explanation, he felt that unmistakable sensation of not being alone, the feeling of being watched. He stood up and scanned the area, but there was nothing there. Forcing himself to ignore it, he bent down again and continued working. Still, he couldn't concentrate. Then he heard something faint, so distant he thought he had imagined it, a weak, far-off wail. He dismissed it as a dog or someone calling out from the nearby houses. Moments later, the sound returned, clearer and closer. It was a woman's cry, long and drawn out. His body stiffened as he turned around, but the fields were empty, nothing but crops swaying in the wind. He kept working, but when the third wail came, it was unmistakable. It was too close. He could hear it clearly, as if the woman were standing nearby but hidden. The crying sounded exhausted, as though whoever was making it had been crying for hours and had no strength left. My grandfather grabbed the lamp and shined it between the rows, but there was nothing, only emptiness. Then came the final wail, softer than before, almost a whisper, as if it were fading away. Yet it was right in front of him. That was when he noticed something terrifying. The crops ahead of him were moving on their own. The weeds parted slowly, bending as if something invisible were walking through them. The sound of crying came directly from that moving line. Without thinking, my grandfather ran. He ran faster than he ever had, never looking back, afraid of what might be following him. When he reached the village, my grandmother found him pale and shaking, barely able to speak. He told her he had heard someone crying in the fields, so close he could almost feel it. She didn't hesitate. She told him it was La Llorona and that many people had heard her there. From that night on, my grandfather never stayed in the fields after dark again. But hearing her wasn't the worst part. Seeing her was far worse, and one of his co-workers experienced that fate. His name was Joaquin. One morning around 4, Joaquin arrived early to work his land, hoping to finish before noon. As he watered the crops, the hose suddenly stopped working. The water simply cut off, something that never happened there. As he checked the main valve, he heard a terrible sound, not a cry, but a painful groan, like a woman struggling to breathe. His skin crawled as he turned toward the field. Among the crops stood a woman wearing a long white dress, like a wedding gown, spotless despite the mud. A veil covered her face. She wasn't walking. She floated just above the ground, moving slowly as she moaned in agony. Joaquin tried to scream, but no sound came out. All he could do was back away in terror. The figure continued forward, growing fainter until she disappeared among the furrows. At that exact moment, the water returned. From that day on, my grandfather never doubted the stories again. What I'm about to describe still fills me with fear. What we experienced at the lagoons changed the way we see the night forever. I was with my coworker, Julio. We worked delivering merchandise to small convenience stores, driving long routes that often left us exhausted. That night we were returning after a long day. It was around 2 in the morning, and we were driving a pickup truck along the narrow road that runs beside the lagoons. The road was lonely, lined with a few streetlights that barely illuminated anything, surrounded by silence. We were starving, and the exhaustion made everything feel heavier. I looked for a place to stop where we wouldn't block traffic. After a short distance, we saw a small clearing by the roadside, right where a grassy area began. I parked there and turned off the engine, leaving the interior light on. We took out what little food we had left, half-cold sandwiches and some juice. Outside, the darkness swallowed everything, but the lagoons were faintly visible. Despite the unease, the landscape was beautiful. Inside the truck, we talked quietly about work, about wanting new cars, about how badly we needed rest. Everything felt calm until a sudden sound cut through the silence. It sounded like a baby crying. Julio stopped chewing and looked at me. I nodded, but we both laughed nervously, convincing ourselves it had to be an animal or a distant car. We continued eating, but then the crying returned. This time it was clearer and lasted longer. There was no doubt. It was a baby. Our smiles disappeared instantly. We looked at each other in silence, both thinking the same thing. Someone had abandoned a baby out here. Without hesitation, we got out of the truck. The cold was intense, and our breath was visible in the air. The grass swayed slightly in the breeze, and the lagoon lay dark and still in the distance. There were no houses, no cars, no people. Just the two of us. The crying stopped, then started again, coming from the grass ahead, only a few feet away. We walked slowly, using our phone flashlights, shivering as we searched, but there was nothing there. As we approached the edge of the lagoon, an overwhelming sense of wrongness washed over me. The crying stopped again, then returned. But this time it came from the water, not splashing, not drowning sounds, normal crying coming from inside the lagoon. That made no sense. A cold sensation ran down my spine like icy fingers brushing my skin. "We need to leave, now," Julio said. We turned back quickly, slipping slightly on the damp grass, and jumped into the truck. I tried to start it, but my hands were shaking so badly the keys kept slipping. When the engine finally started, we heard it. A long, piercing scream full of pain and despair. We froze. Seconds later, the scream returned, closer this time. It was unbearable, as if the woman's throat were torn apart. My heart pounded so fast I felt dizzy and had to brake for a moment. "Hurry up, please!" Julio shouted. I drove forward again, and out of fear and curiosity, we turned to look toward the lagoon. I wish we hadn't. Through the mist above the water, we saw a thin white figure wearing a long dress. She wasn't walking or sinking. She was floating on the surface, crying endlessly. I knew what we were seeing. When I could finally think clearly, I stepped on the accelerator and didn't slow down. The figure faded into the mist behind us. After that night, neither of us wanted to drive that road again after dark, but work forced us to. Over time, we managed to laugh about it, but only because we weren't there anymore. Facing her in person was something else entirely. My name is Franco, and what I'm about to describe happened 5 years ago while I was working as a waiter at an event venue. Being a waiter meant long shifts and exhaustion, but that night was worse than usual. The event dragged on endlessly. The guests refused to leave, and the band kept playing. I didn't get out at 10 or 11 or even midnight. I left close to 2:30 in the morning. I was completely drained. My legs burned from standing for hours. My clothes smelled like spilled beer and cold food, and I was starving because I hadn't sat down all day. My friends left by car. I usually took a taxi, but that night none of them wanted to drive me home. They said it was too far, that they didn't go there anymore, so I had to choose, wait until dawn or walk. As always, I chose to walk. There was a longer route along the main avenues, but there was also the canal path. Everyone avoided it because it was dark, deserted, and had no streetlights, but it was the fastest way home. That night, exhausted and half asleep, I didn't think twice. I just wanted to get there. As soon as I entered the canal path, the stench of sewage hit me. The air was freezing, unnaturally cold for that time of year. I kept walking, telling myself it wasn't so bad. There was hardly anyone around. But halfway through, everything changed. Dogs began barking and howling in the distance, then closer. Dogs often barked at drunks or other animals, but this was different. They sounded afraid. I tried to ignore it. I kept telling myself it was normal. Then I heard it, a long, ugly wail. It came from where the dogs were howling. Among all that noise, the cry stood out clearly. My heart started pounding. I kept walking, watching the ground so I wouldn't trip, but every sound made me tense. A few steps later, I heard the wail again, this time behind me, clear and deep, like a woman crying from her chest just 20 meters away. I turned quickly. There was nothing, only darkness. The dogs ran toward me, barking furiously, and climbed onto the canal walls, snarling at empty air. I froze. My breathing became rapid. Something felt terribly wrong. My mind tried to explain it away. Maybe the dogs were playing, maybe someone was hurt. But my body knew better. Fear flooded me. The dogs came closer, barking at something they could see, but I couldn't. They didn't even notice me. I swallowed hard and took a few steps forward. Immediately, the wail sounded ahead of me, impossibly close, as if the woman had moved faster than anything human. The dogs rushed ahead again, growling and circling the unseen presence. My neck ached from tension. I didn't know whether to run or stay still. I shouted in desperation, cursed aloud, and then everything went silent. A silence so deep my ears rang. Even the dogs stopped. I continued walking without looking to either side, staring at the ground, repeating that nothing was there, that I was just tired. Then I heard it again, a soft "sue" near my ear, followed by furious barking. That broke me. I walked faster, almost stumbling, afraid to turn around. When I finally reached the opening to my street, relief washed over me. But then the final wail echoed behind me, deep, powerful, and unbearable. It felt like something squeezed my chest. I became dizzy, my hands sweating, my legs trembling. I felt a presence behind me, cold, heavy, filled with sorrow that wasn't mine. I moved forward without looking back. As soon as I stepped onto the lit street, the wailing stopped instantly. The dogs approached me, calm and friendly now, and followed me all the way home. I didn't know them, but they stayed until I reached my door. From that night on, I never walked near that canal again. I didn't see her, but I heard her. And whenever I can, I feed the dogs that protected me that night. My name is Diana, and this is something that happened to my father when he was young. He grew up in a small rural town surrounded by hills, knolls, and open pastures. My family had worked with livestock for generations, and from a very early age, my father learned how to care for sheep, horses, and cows. He was only 15 years old when this happened. Even now, he isn't easily frightened, but whenever he remembers that morning, his expression changes. The experience left a mark on him. That day, he woke up around 4:30 in the morning. He had to take some sheep to a field near the house. It was part of his daily routine. Open the corral gate, guide the animals on his father's horse, lead them to the grazing area, and make sure none wandered off. At that hour, most people in town were already awake and working, but the higher fields near the mountain were usually empty. The morning was quiet. All he could hear were crickets, the cold wind coming down from the mountain, and the soft sound of the sheep chewing. People in the town always said strange things happened in the mountains, but my father wasn't afraid. While the sheep grazed, one restless female began to wander away from the group. He noticed her slowly climbing the slope of the mountain. He considered going after her, but then he realized something wasn't right. The sheep stopped after only a few meters. She didn't move, eat, or make a sound. She stood completely still, as if frozen. That was when my father saw her. A little higher up the mountain, standing in the darkness, was a woman dressed in white. She was tall and slender, wearing a gown that looked like a wedding dress. He couldn't see her face. Her hair hung loose and extremely long, reaching all the way to her feet. It was clear she wasn't touching the ground. She hovered just a few centimeters above it. The sheep stared at her, paralyzed. My father made a quick decision. He left the animal where it was and turned back. He didn't dare climb any higher. As he headed toward the house, his breathing grew heavy. The air felt thick, and the cold intensified. Halfway down, he heard the first wail. He walked faster. His arms were numb with cold, his hands sweating, his legs trembling without control. The crying came again, long and echoing, stretching across the valley before cutting off abruptly. When he was only a few meters from the corral, the wail sounded again. But this time it came from below, as if she were already in the center of the village. He didn't go back for the sheep. Fear overwhelmed him. He opened the corral gate, brought in the animals that had followed him, and shut everything without looking back. He stood there for several minutes, shaking. When he finally went inside, his mother saw him pale and drenched in sweat. He could barely speak. She looked at him and asked if he had heard her. He answered that he had seen her. They couldn't leave the sheep out there. Later, they returned together. My grandmother and my father went back to the field. They found the woman who had gone up the mountain lying in the same place, but she was dead. There were no wounds. She had simply died. On the way home, my grandmother told him never to take the animals out before daylight again. He obeyed from that day on. In the village, people rarely heard La Llorona at night, but once you heard her cry, you never forgot it. What happened to me took place several years ago, in 2011, in a small community called San Pedro, Tlacutepec. It's a place I remember clearly. Back then, the streets were dirt roads. There were very few streetlights, empty lots everywhere, and houses separated by long stretches of darkness, usually guarded only by stray dogs. At that time, my family was dealing with frequent thefts. It wasn't anything extreme, but it was constant: tools, construction materials, cables. We were still building the house and things kept disappearing. Because of that, my father decided to install a security camera facing the street. It was a simple old camera that recorded onto an SD card, but it gave us peace of mind. We had been using the camera for several months without incident. That night, we went to bed early. I was 17 years old at the time and had just turned 17. I stayed awake chatting with friends on Facebook, and before I realized it, it was already 1 a.m. That was when we heard it. A woman crying outside the house. At first it was soft, almost distant, but then it turned into a desperate scream. I felt a rush of fear, thinking someone nearby might be hurt and needed help. I was about to step outside when the sound suddenly stopped. I told my friends online about it, but they laughed it off, so I tried to forget it and went to sleep. The next morning, we checked the camera's memory card. I told my parents what I had heard, and they wanted to see if anything had been recorded. At the start of the video, the street looked normal, dark and empty. Then the microphone picked up the cry. It was clearly an adult woman's voice, long and uneven, rising and falling in volume. But nothing appeared on the screen. Only when the scream echoed through the recording did something strange happen. My father paused the video. I felt frozen. The crying sounded so close to the microphone that it felt as if the woman were standing right beside the camera. We kept watching. For a brief moment, almost impossible to see, something white crossed the street. It didn't move like a person. It moved slowly, like fabric drifting. We lowered the volume because my mother was getting nervous, but even without sound, the movement was obvious, passing between the trees across the road. My father finally spoke. He said it looked like La Llorona. The figure appeared twice in the recording, crying both times, and then vanished completely. The video is gone now, lost over time. Maybe that's for the best. Watching it left a deep impression on me, and no one should ever have to see something like that again. That night, after seeing the pale figure on the camera, sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the empty lots outside made my heart leap. Even the faintest whisper of wind sounded like her sorrowful cries carried through the darkness. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, bending unnaturally across the walls of the street. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the fear that lingered was too real to ignore. As the hours crawled past, I kept thinking about that fleeting glimpse of white on the recording. The figure hadn't moved like a person. She had glided, hovering just above the ground, her dress fluttering slightly as if caught in a breeze that existed only around her. The cries were the worst part, long, uneven wails that rose and fell, echoing in my mind even when the screen went black. I felt certain she wasn't bound by the day or night. Her sorrow followed me relentlessly. The following days did nothing to ease my dread. Walking past the empty lots near the street, I noticed things that hadn't seemed out of place before. Shadows shifting against the walls, the grass along the sidewalk swaying though the wind had died, and a faint, persistent hum that sounded like a soft, mournful sob. Every time I saw a glimpse of white moving in my peripheral vision, I froze, unable to breathe, waiting for the unmistakable cry to follow. One night, curiosity and fear pulled me to the edge of the street again. The moon was bright, casting silver light over the dirt road, the same road that had felt so normal before the camera incident. But that night, it felt entirely different. The air was heavier, thicker, and the silence pressed against my ears. I could almost hear a heartbeat in the ground beneath me, slow and trembling. Then, from somewhere above the empty lots, a wail rose, long, broken, desperate. I stopped completely, every muscle frozen. My mind screamed to run, but my body could only shiver in place. The sound moved with the wind, changing direction, sometimes faint, sometimes loud, always sorrowful. I could feel a presence, cold and oppressive, wrapping around me like a cloak I couldn't remove. It was impossible to see her clearly, but I knew, just knew, that she was close, watching, hovering, and crying endlessly. The hours stretched until dawn, yet the fear never left me. During the day, the street looked harmless, empty and quiet, but I could never forget how the lots and the dirt road had seemed alive that night. Even when I walked past the area later, the memory of that soft, uneven cry made my skin crawl. It was as if she had left a piece of herself behind in the shadows, something I could feel pressing against my chest. I never walked that street at night again. I avoided the lots, the empty stretches, even the corners where her presence had seemed strongest. The cries, the fleeting glimpses of white, and the oppressive sorrow became something I carried with me long after the night ended. Sometimes, even years later, a faint wail on the wind reminds me of her, and the chill runs straight to my bones. La Llorona is not a story. She is a presence, a shadow that drifts between the living and the dead, bound by grief that never ceases. Once seen, once heard, she leaves her mark, and some things cannot be forgotten. Even now, when the wind whistles across empty streets or the shadows seem too still, I cannot shake the thought that she is out there, waiting, crying, watching. And I know, deep down, that anyone who encounters her will feel the same relentless fear. Impossible to forget, impossible to escape.